Good evening, blog viewers. Today we'll cycle back. Well, we haven't really talked about this virtue as much, but we'll start developing the virtue of justice, and to do that, we have to first think about what it means to be just. I think most people, as with many of the virtues, most people most of the time think they are in fact acting very justly. There are very few occasions where people actually admit or think that they are acting in any way unjustly. And some think that, obviously, I think the main reason for this is this sort of dominant idea that we have, that basically following basic, simple laws, whether criminal or civil in nature, like don't kill, don't steal when you're in a store, don't go through a red light, follow the traffic laws, pay your taxes on time. This is all that's included in the notion of justice, sort of the dominant view. This is what it means to be a just person. Don't kill, don't steal, don't avoid your taxes, and don't go through a red light. If you do those things, you'll basically be a just person. And everything beyond that, under this dominant view, is outside of the world of justice in some way, shape, or form. Those matters, while still being very important, they don't, in fact, bear on or relate to whether someone is just or unjust. And I think, in general, for reasons we'll see throughout the post, this is a very minimalistic conception of justice that probably doesn't do justice to the virtue of justice. Now, as is usually the case when we start with a thinker, we're going to look at Aristotle's ideas in Book 5 of the Nicomachean Ethics. And as is usually the case with Aristotle, his ideas on justice begin with sort of common, ordinary conceptions, but then venture way, way beyond them in the development of his particular philosophical theories and ideas on the human virtues. Now, in Book 5 of the Ethics, Aristotle discusses his conceptions not only of justice and injustice, but the just act and the unjust act, the just man and the unjust man, and even different forms of different particular types of justice, moving well beyond, again, the sort of the dominant view we sketched out in the very beginning of the post. Now, the points Aristotle makes in this Book 5 about justice are very wide-ranging, so I think it'd be helpful to segregate them into 5 or 6 different sort of clusters. And the first idea that comes through for Aristotle is that justice is a state of character, fundamentally at its deepest level, is a state of character that allows a person to repetitively do what is just and avoid what is unjust. Contrary, injustice is again a state of character, a state of soul under the Aristotelian terminology, that encourages someone to repetitively do, or that powerfully moves someone, perhaps is the better way to put it, to do what is unjust and avoid doing what is just. And to quote Aristotle here in the very beginning of the book, Book 5, Aristotle writes, we see that all men mean by justice that kind of state of character which makes people disposed to do what is just and makes them act justly and wish for what is just, and similarly by injustice, that state which makes them act unjustly and wish for what is unjust. Now, Aristotle recognizes, of course, that there are certain things in the world that we pursue that are most likely to bear upon or activate or call into play our notions of justice and injustice. Under this conception that he formulated, justice is not present in every action or in every area of human life. For example, how someone would admire a sunset would not bear into play. We wouldn't say this person justly looks at the sunset, this person unjustly looked at the sunset. That doesn't make any sense. But there are certain things that people do, certain activities, certain pursuits that do involve justice in much more direct ways. And for the unjust person, Aristotle says, the unjust man, he says, again in the beginning of Book 5, since the unjust man is grasping, he must be concerned with goods, not all goods, but those with which prosperity and adversity have to do, which taken absolutely are always good, but for a particular person are not always good. Now men pray for and pursue these things, but they should not, but should pray that the things that are good absolutely may also be good for them, and should choose the things that are good for them. Sort of the key point. So everyone pursues or particularly the unjust person pursues things that most people broadly agree are good. Again, things like wealth and power and reputation, prestige, various sensual pleasures. These are things that broadly people across many different societies and times have viewed as actually good things. And the unjust person sort of grasps at these things, doesn't really think about, instead of thinking about what is actually good for him or her, whether these things are actually good or in what way they'd be good for him or her, the person just grasps for all of these things at the same time. And because of that, in Aristotle's view, often becomes an unjust person. And because of that, for the unjust person, even things that are otherwise good for a just person, for example, money could be very good for a just person that uses it to sort of take care of his basic needs, help others that are just, help others that are virtuous, promote activities that are worthwhile for himself and others, for the city and for inhabitants, and various educational pursuits, various recreational pursuits that are drawn and deepen one's appreciation of the natural goodness of life. But for an unjust person, money could be used in ways that are not at all good for the person, and would be better off with less money so that he couldn't harm himself in these kinds of ways. Now, the person, again, so similarly to Plato's ideas here, an unjust person, I think, both for Aristotle and for Plato, uses everything poorly. Whatever good there is around him or her, person uses it poorly, makes a mess of everything. And that was, again, a notion we saw in many of the Platonic dialogues. Now, because of the pursuit of things like these goods, like wealth and power and reputation and prestige, sensual pleasures, because these things require and draw upon many different human faculties, they take a lot of time to actually achieve in the ordinary case. And in general, basically kind of complicated endeavors for people to achieve any sort of money, any sort of power, any sort of reputation, any sort of prestige, very essential pleasures, similarly, probably less so. But Aristotle thinks that justice includes, because it's involved in the pursuit of these things, it includes many virtues beyond sort of a simplistic notion of justice itself. Because the pursuits of these things are so complicated and involve so many different things. Just in pursuing things justly, it would make sense that justice itself would be sort of a more complicated virtue than some of the other virtues. And Aristotle, in fact, in Book 5, equates complete justice with complete virtue, sort of perfect virtue and complete virtue of all types. And we see that in the passage that I'm going to read right now. And Aristotle writes here, "And the law bids us do both the acts of a brave man, not to desert our post, nor to take flight, nor throw away our arms, and those of a temperate man, not to commit adultery, nor to gratify one's lust, and those of a good-tempered man, not to strike another, nor to speak evil." And similarly, with regard to the other virtues and forms of wickedness, commanding some acts and forbidding others. And the rightly framed law does this rightly, and the hastily conceived one less well. This form of justice, then, is complete virtue, but not absolutely, but in relation to our neighbor. And therefore justice is often thought to be the greatest of all virtues. And neither evening nor morning star is so wonderful. And proverbially, in justice is every virtue comprehended. And it is complete virtue in its fullest sense, because it is the actual exercise of complete virtue. So Aristotle could hardly praise justice any more than he did in this passage. He calls it complete virtue. He calls it the greatest of all virtues. He calls it a wonderful virtue. He says in justice is every virtue comprehended, and in its actual exercise, every virtue is activated. Now, this is a critical point, and I think Aristotle actually has this right here. Think about a situation, for example, where someone has wronged you, and you're going to decide at some point whether to forgive this person. When you will forgive them, under what circumstances, under what conditions you will forgive them, how you will communicate this message of forgiveness to the person, and then how you will actually live out that sort of forgiveness over time that you've actually granted the person. The person has undeniably wronged you. There is no question about that fact. Person admits it. The facts are clear to everybody. The reality cannot be changed. You have been wrong. But you actually want to forgive this person, which is an act of justice in some form, of course. Now, Aristotle's point is that all of this, all these considerations, how you'll forgive them, when you'll forgive them, under what conditions, in what circumstances, how you'll communicate it, how you'll actually live out that forgiveness, all of this involves not just one virtue of justice, but it involves many, many different virtues, all at the same time sort of mixed together. Hard to even separate these virtues out from one another. And I think he's got that very right. In this example, we can see, for example, to decide whether to forgive someone and in what cases and all those sorts of things. The virtues of practical wisdom, courage, to stick with your decision, to find the right balance between forgiveness and just simply forgetting about what happened. The virtues of love and moderation, to not sort of pick an extreme solution or an extreme form of forgiveness that would have a lot of sort of conditions on it. And of course, virtues of friendship would be involved if it was a friend. So in this sense, we can see that in this example, just the simple act of forgiveness, which could be considered a just act, would involve many different virtues. And in that sense, we can view justice as sort of the culmination or sort of the practical exercise, as Aristotle says, of many, many different virtues in one. Now, Aristotle thinks beyond this notion of complete justice, there are particular types of justice that are involved and sort of particular to the situations. And he gives two instances of it. One is the type of justice involved when people are making distributions of money or honor and or similar things among people and what people deserve. And the second is involved in sort of rectifying injuries when someone's been injured and we want to sort of make whole the person that has been injured and put them back in the position that they deserve to be in, or to sort of redress an injustice. On these points, Aristotle basically says any inequality between persons that is undeserved must be rectified. Any sort of in certain situations, a judge or a third person may have to come in and rectify the injustice by putting the people back in sort of the equal situation they were in before, or the position they should have been in before. But that's not the best situation, and Aristotle makes clear that sort of the best man is the person who can see an inequality and then do something to sort of equalize the relationship between the parties to the position of equality that it should have been, based on the particular circumstances, of course, and the particular contributions of the two people to either a relationship or to a friendship or whatever. But the best situation is the person that sees the imbalance or so the inequality, the improportion, and sees it and wants to rectify it and does rectify it. And Aristotle thinks this is such an important part of what this is not only an important part of what justice is, but Aristotle thinks this type of justice of correcting imbalances and correcting inequalities and correcting injustices, rectifying injustices, is the very foundational building block of a city, which holds it together. A city that can't do these kinds of things in the right way, can't correct injustices, can't put people in the equal positions they should be based on their merit and contributions to things. This kind of society or this kind of city, Aristotle thinks is a bad one, is not likely to prosper and flourish like a city that would put people in those, would rectify injustices quickly and appropriately, and would put back to people positions of the relative equality they deserve. And so that is a very important point for Aristotle, which he stresses here when he writes, "For it is by proportionate requital that the city holds together. For it is by proportionate requital that the city holds together. For this is characteristic of grace. We should serve in return one who has shown grace to us, and should another time take the initiative in showing it. And justice is that in virtue of which the just man is said to be a doer, by choice of that which is just, and one who will distribute either between himself and another, or between two others, not so as to give more of what is desirable to himself and less to his neighbor, and conversely with what was harmful, but so as to give what is equal, in accordance with proportion, and similarly in distributing between two other persons. So finally, I think, two more points Aristotle brings out in Book 5. Aristotle brings out the important recognition that a single unjust act does not mean that someone is unjust. This is a very sort of critical point as we sort of survey the people in our lives and the unjust actions or just actions. And we want to reach sort of an appropriate assessment of people, a fair, honest, real assessment of the people's characters in our lives as we mature and we make decisions about who we want to spend more time with and who we want to spend less time with. And Aristotle says that it's not a single unjust act that makes someone unjust. It just means the person has done an unjust act. He's acted unjustly or she's acted unjustly. And Aristotle has various reasons for thinking that. He says that an action could be done with the reasonable expectation that would produce a just result, but in fact reality working the way, as we've stressed, reality working the way it does, unpredictably, it turns out that the action was reasonably intended to produce a just result, but in fact produces a very unjust result. The person is not unjust for doing that. A person makes a mistake and acts unjustly, just simply forgets, for example, to do something he's required to do. It's an unjust act, but again, no one would say this person is unjust just for forgetting to do something that's required of him. Person acts unjustly in this third example that Aristotle gives, knows it's unjust, but hasn't really deliberated fully about the issue. He's sort of drawn by his passions or sort of thinks about the issue haphazardly and just kind of goes forward. Again, it's an unjust act, but the person's still not unjust. The person hasn't shown himself to be unjust. Person hasn't really thought through the issues as much. Sort of acts sort of instinctively or uncritically. But the action is unjust. But a person still is not. Aristotle still doesn't want to label this person unjust. Finally, though, when a person has deliberated fully about an issue, has thought it through, knows it to be wrong, and then still acts, still chooses sort of an unjust act, then we can say that person is unjust under the Aristotelian conception. Then we know the person has sort of revealed his unjustness, not just in the act, but in the person, because the person has had the chance to deliberate. We know he's thought about the issue, he knows it to be wrong, but just continues forward anyway. Now, Aristotle gives the example, for example, of an adulterer. If someone acts in the heat of passion, perhaps just one or two times, this would be an unjust act, certainly. Adultery is not a form of justice. It's a form of injustice. But the person is not still fundamentally an unjust person. But if a person acts repeatedly, commits this kind of action repeatedly, and basically after the first time or second time should know or does know, really should know at that point that it's wrong, then we can say this person is not only acting unjustly, but this person is an unjust person. So that was that's one of the critical distinctions Aristotle brings out toward the end of Book 5. Then Aristotle ends the book by praising the man who is equitable. He uses this term of the equitable man. And he praises the equitable man as even being above the just man. The equitable is, in Aristotle's view, even superior to perfect justice. And he writes, the same thing then is just and equitable. And while both are good, the equitable is superior. What creates the problem is that the equitable is just, but not the legally just, but a correction of legal justice. The reason is that all law is universal, but about some things it is not possible to make a universal statement which shall be correct. In those cases, then, in which it is necessary to speak universally, but not possible to do so correctly, the law takes the usual case, though it is not ignorant of the possibility of error. And it is none the less correct, for the error is not in the law nor in the legislator, but in the nature of the thing, since the matter of practical affairs is of this kind from the start. So the equitable action here is where someone does something just that is not spelled out in a rule or written in stone somewhere or in a manual or in some guidebook or on the internet. Person just does the just thing, but it's not spelled out anywhere for him. Person has sort of developed his moral sensibilities so acutely, so finely, so perfectly, that he's able to come up with solutions to problems that go well beyond doing just the legally just action, what's sort of required of you formally by the law. And person resolves problems that are not even addressed by the requirements of the law. Sort of moves well beyond the law, never breaking the law, always adhering to the law, but seeing situations and problems in his life that are not at all addressed by any rule or law, because, as Aristotle says, it's impossible to correctly issue a law on every issue or every problem of reality. Reality, as we've stressed, is so complex, and reality produces so many problems and so many infinite shades of problems for humans to resolve, that it's not enough just to look in some guidebook somewhere or follow some law just to get everything right. And so for Aristotle, this person, this equitable person, comes up with solutions that move beyond what's just legally just, and does so by taking very seriously the complicated nature of problems that are presented in human life. He doesn't sort of use the complicated nature of human problems as sort of an excuse, as many do, to sort of run away from the attempt to solve complicated problems and say, oh, it's complicated, what are you going to do about it? Oh, it's a difficult issue. But person understands it's a difficult issue, understands there's no clear law that applies, but still has this equitable sense and reaches solutions, all the while recognizing how difficult the correct solution is to achieve. Now, it's hard to disagree in a meaningful sense. Of course, we can sort of pick simple little objections to Aristotle's ideas, but those are not fruitful, and we won't do that, as we haven't done in any of the posts, really. So it's hard to disagree, though, in a meaningful way with many of Aristotle's ideas on justice. But there are, I think, a few points that require supplementation. One is with regard to this critical distinction between the unjust act and the unjust person, or the just act and the just person. I think the conception of clustering may be very helpful. And the clustering concept that I'm sort of thinking about is maybe useful is a concept that would help us distinguish between the unjust act and the unjust person, and the just act and the just person. If person's actions habitually over the course of, let's say, several years cluster, if their actions, if you could plot all their actions mentally, probably not, you can't do it on a piece of paper, but if you were to mentally map out their actions and they sort of cluster around this sort of zone of injustice or unjust actions, and whatever the reason is, whether they haven't thought about it in the complicated, Aristotle makes this four-part complicated breakdown of what the reason was for the unjust act. But I think whatever the reason, if their actions continue to cluster for many, many years in a zone of injustice, maybe some acts more unjust, spectacularly unjust, some acts less unjust, but still minimally unjust, some acts just kind of unjust. And the same for justice, and the very just acts, minimally just acts, just following the law, and similarly. Person's actions cluster there for whatever reason, then we know they're either unjust or just. And we don't know that forever, of course, because we don't know anything forever. But until we see that the actions are clustering in a different zone now, then we can sort of have confidence that this person is either just or unjust from the clustering of their actions. And I think Aristotle sort of alludes to this idea, but he doesn't draw it out explicitly in his discussion of justice in Book 5. And I think the only exception here, I think this idea works, but perhaps the only exception would be some sort of serious form of psychological disease or disorder. A person's actions tend to cluster in injustice because of the fundamental psychological problems, some fundamental problems of comprehending reality in the same ways that most people do. Then I think we can say they're not necessarily an unjust person, they're just suffering from various mental limitations of some sort or another. It's important not to take that argument too seriously and find mental or psychological disease in everyone. Any sort of the very act of an unjust act, the very proof of an unjust act being a sign of mental or psychological disease. That's probably going way too far. But I think in some cases we can see that someone really does suffer from some sort of psychological imbalance of some sort or defect, and if that's medically, and that sort of corresponds to sort of broadly accepted medical ideas, then I think it's okay to give that person not a break, but not to totally label them as unjust, but label them more as sort of in need of mental treatment or psychological treatment. But if that need is pointed out to the person by you or other people, and the person still doesn't seek the psychological counseling or help he needs, or whatever medical treatment, then I think we can say that's less of a mitigating factor, and the person is still unjust because the defect has been sort of proposed to them and they're still not willing to do anything about it. So I think in those situations we can probably say the person is still an unjust person. The second point of amplification is, I think, that we need to make here is that to be a just person, you need to actually seek out as much relevant information as you can before making a particular decision about what is just under the circumstances, or what is fair division under the circumstances, or how you can properly rectify a wrong done to someone under the circumstances. And to make a fair division between people, or to rectify wrongs or a circumstance that has been unjust to someone, you have to actually know what happened. You can't just sort of trust what someone said or go on based on one account and totally forget everything else. You have to get as deep and complete account of what was said, what was done, what everyone's intentions were at the time, what people wrote down at the time, because that's going to be probably the best evidence of what happened. You must have as many facts to bear on the issue that relates to whether you're going to act in one way or the other, or you must have as many facts that bear on what is the just resolution of the situation as is possible. And only when you have those things will you then act. Aristotle, I think, places a lot of emphasis on the person simply having a good character, which for him was so important, and a good state of soul, and that person would instinctively be drawn to just finding and correctly doing the just actions. But I don't think he discusses as much as he should the need for facts before making decisions that bear on what is the just outcome, and having as many facts and taking those facts seriously, reading and interviewing people and talking with people and getting as much information as you can, as is humanly possible, before making a decision. Not at all just sort of going with the first idea that pops up in your mind as to what is just. And I think someone can have a very virtuous character in the Aristotelian sense, but without the relevant facts, without the relevant information, without the relevant continual updating of information, this person, I don't think, can do the justice, can do the just acts repetitively that I think Aristotle seems to think he can. And then finally, I think justice does seem to involve, at a very deep level, what Aristotle says about men grasping for goods that are not good for all people, but good relative to a person's character. I think that's a big part of what it means to habitually do just actions. But I don't think Aristotle draws it out completely. He sort of alludes to the point, but he doesn't sort of complete it. And I think a person will, over time, gradually become more just if he actually thinks about what is good for him in his own particular circumstances of his life, which are different for every person. Not just what is widely regarded as good, doesn't just sort of leap to going for what is generally accepted as good by most people, often with little thought or attention to why it is good or in what way it's good. Now, a person that comes to know what is actually good for him will, I think, naturally and powerfully act in ways that are more just over time. For example, a person discovers that his life's passion is teaching yoga in the inner cities because he finds yoga to be a very intrinsically good activity. He locates his good in doing this activity. I think this person will, over time, if he really understands that, really intellectually, in its full dimension, understands why that is good for him, how it draws upon his many resources and his many talents and his many strengths of character and what he intrinsically likes doing. A person will not grasp for things anymore that are sort of widely accepted to be good, because he's aiming all the time at what he locates to be his own personal good. And he will not see the things that he was formerly grasping at, or what everyone is grasping at in often unjust ways, as being very good at all. And I think over time this will produce a more just character. I think this is similar to Nietzsche's sublimation idea, but also a little different. Person ultimately, under this account, locates his good on a very deep level in activities that would not require him to be unjust. Person locates his good on, again, this activity that is personally good for him and that would not involve any form of injustice, any form of grasping. And in the end, the person achieves perfect justice by locating his own perfect and highly personal conception of good. Then person has sort of moved beyond the need for any grasping, moved beyond and grown beyond the need for any sort of unjust act. And I think that is an account of justice that Aristotle hints at but doesn't finally conclude or sort of end the argument in those ways, which I think might be fruitful. So with that, we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.